All right, so today we're diving deep right into the heart of the state.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, and we've got these excerpts from, a longer text that you flagged as being really, really fascinating. And
Yeah, it's
I gotta say, even just skimming it, I can totally see why it's this whirlwind. It's like ancient Greece to the Muslim world, all the way to modern Pakistan.
yeah, no, it's a fascinating journey. And one of the things that struck me right away was how much we kind of take the concept of the state for granted.
Right, like
It seems so fundamental, but as this source points out, it's a relatively recent invention.
Oh, that's so true.
Yeah.
Like, we learn about ancient Greece and their city-states or terms like al-Jama and al-Sultan used in early Islamic societies.
Right.
And it really hits you, like the way people have thought about governance, it's evolved dramatically over time.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, like, how effective were those early forms of governance?
Yeah.
What were their strengths and weaknesses compared to what we have today?
That's such a good question.
And I think it highlights a key point. Like, different terminology often reflects a fundamentally different understanding of power and authority.
Like, for example?
Take al-Sultan, for example.
Okay.
The term implies a strong, centralized figure.
Right.
But it doesn't necessarily speak to the mechanisms of accountability.
Okay.
Or the limits of that power.
Okay, so how did we get from city-states and sultans to this modern nation-state model that just like dominates the world today?
Yeah.
Our source mentions some European thinkers like Machiavelli and Bodin. What role did they play in this?
Oh, they were absolutely pivotal.
Okay.
Think of them as like architects laying the foundation for the modern state.
Okay, I like that.
Machiavelli with his focus on realpolitik and the acquisition of power.
Right.
And Bodin emphasizing the concept of sovereignty.
Yeah.
These ideas were radical for their time. Yeah.
They were really new. Yeah, okay. So these European thinkers really set the stage for this idea of a sovereign nation with like defined borders, a centralized government.
Absolutely.
But what's interesting is how our source then connects this evolution of the state concept to Islam.
Right.
Knowing your interest in the interplay of religion and politics, I feel like this must have really jumped out at you.
Oh, absolutely. And what makes it even more intriguing is that, as the source points out, Islam, in its early years, didn't have a distinct political theory in the way that we might think of it today.
So it wasn't about, like, dictating a specific form of government.
Right.
Was it more focused on just, like, individual behavior and morality?
Right. There's definitely an element of that, yeah. I mean, religion often emphasizes personal ethics.
Right.
Moral development, not necessarily the nuts and bolts of running a government.
Okay.
But it goes deeper than that.
Okay.
Early Islamic thought didn't view the state as this, like, fixed, immutable institution in the same way that Western political thought later did.
So instead of a blueprint for the state, what did Islam offer?
Yeah.
Our source mentions this concept of shura, which I understand means consultation.
Right.
Could you elaborate on that for us?
Sure. So shura is a central principle in Islamic governance.
Okay.
And it emphasizes the importance of leaders consulting with the people they govern.
Right.
It's not just about a ruler making decisions in isolation.
So even though a ruler might have been seen as, I don't know, having divinely inspired authority,
right,
they still needed to consider the opinions and consent of the people.
Yeah.
Isn't that kind of like an early form of democracy?
That's a great point, and it reveals a lot.
But wouldn't some argue that even with consultation, the ruler still held ultimate power?
That's right, yeah. And it reveals a lot about the nuances of power dynamics in those historical contexts.
Okay.
So while shura provided a mechanism for input and feedback, it didn't necessarily equate to the kind of shared power we see in modern democracies.
Right.
It's more about ensuring that the ruler is informed, considers different perspectives, and acts in a way that reflects the best interests of the community.
Okay.
Yeah.
This brings us to another concept our source highlights, which is ijtihad, or independent legal reasoning.
Yes.
What exactly does that mean?
Yeah.
And how does it relate to this whole discussion about Islam and the state?
Ijtihad is this crucial concept in Islamic jurisprudence. It essentially means that Islamic scholars and legal experts have the authority to interpret religious texts and apply them to new situations, evolving contexts.
So it's not about rigidly following a set of predetermined rules,
Right,
but more about using reason and judgment to adapt to new challenges and complexities.
Right.
Interesting, but how does this idea of ijtihad connect to this broader conversation about the state?
So this is where
and governance.
Our source makes a really interesting point. It highlights how both religious and secular thought, despite starting from very different points, ultimately arrive at surprisingly similar ideas about the state.
Now that's fascinating.
Even though they came from different starting points.
You're telling me that despite their different origins, both religious and secular thought converged on similar ideas about the state?
Exactly. It's like they were on separate journeys.
Wow.
But ended up at a remarkably similar destination. And that destination includes things like constitutions. The division of powers, and the protection of fundamental rights.
Wait a minute.
All of which are core principles in both systems.
I need to process this for a second. So you're saying that both religious and secular systems of thought ended up valuing things like constitutions and the separation of powers?
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
But why is that?
That's a great question. And it takes us right into the heart of what makes this topic so compelling. What we're seeing here is this recognition across different cultures and belief systems of the fundamental principles needed for a just and stable society. Yeah. It really underscores this idea that certain principles of governance, they kind of transcend specific cultural or historical contexts. They speak to like a deeper understanding of human nature. The need for order, the pursuit of a just and equitable society.
It's like humanity's been on this long and winding road, experimenting with different forms of governance, trying to figure out how to live together peacefully and create systems that work.
Right.
And what's amazing is that despite all their differences, both secular and religious thought seem to have converged on this idea that a constitution is crucial.
Yeah, absolutely.
In defining the relationship between the people and the state.
A constitution acts as a sort of like social contract.
Right. It's like the ground rules.
It lays out the ground rules.
It's exactly.
Defines the limits of power. Guarantees fundamental rights.
It protects things like freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, all that stuff.
Exactly.
But speaking of constitutions. Our source specifically describes Pakistan as a modern constitutional state.
Right.
What are the implications of that?
That's a really important point because in theory, at least, Pakistan operates within this framework of constitutionalism, which means that violating the Constitution, it's not just some abstract legal offense. It's a breach of trust between the state and its people.
A broken promise.
Exactly.
But there's this tension here, right? Because our source also points out that Pakistan's current political order in practice deviates from its constitution. So how do they suggest we address that?
How do we fix that?
What path do they see for Pakistan moving forward?
Well, they advocate for a very specific and nuanced approach.
Okay.
They argue that any attempt at reform, it has to be legal.
Okay.
It has to have a high probability of success. And critically, it has to avoid creating further chaos or instability.
So it's not about just blindly pushing for change at any cost.
Right, exactly.
It sounds like they're calling for a much more strategic, measured approach.
Precisely. And they place a huge emphasis on education and training, empowering people to make informed decisions about the best course of action. And this actually ties back to the concept of ijtihad.
Oh, interesting.
Where individuals are encouraged to use reason and judgment to navigate complex situations.
This is where it gets really interesting for me. Because they're essentially saying that even in a modern constitutional state, there's still this need for that kind of independent, critical thinking that ijtihad represents.
Absolutely.
Especially when the situation is messy and there's not always a clear right or wrong answer.
You've hit the nail on the head.
So it's about acknowledging the complexity of the real world and understanding that finding the best path forward requires requires careful consideration, dialogue, a willingness to adapt to changing circumstances.
I think that's a great point.
Our source seems to be advocating for a kind of patient activism, working towards lasting change while being mindful of the potential consequences of our actions.
Of our actions, exactly.
But they also talk about this importance of constitutional and political struggle as the means to purify the system. How do these two ideas coexist?
That's a great question, and it highlights this delicate balance that needs to be struck.
Okay.
They seem to be cautioning against approaches that are overly confrontational or disruptive.
So no storming the parliament buildings.
Probably not the most effective strategy.
Okay, good to know.
Instead, they advocate for a more balanced approach, one that focuses on education, legal reforms, and constructive political engagement.
So working within the system to improve it, rather than seeking to overthrow it entirely.
Exactly.
This reminds me of something you said earlier about how different terms reflect different understandings of power and authority. It seems like the choice of tactics in this political struggle is also a reflection of how one views power and change.
That's a very insightful observation.
Thank you.
And it speaks to the importance of critical thinking.
Okay.
Not just about the goals we're pursuing, but also about the methods we use to achieve them.
So it's evolution, not a revolution.
I think that's a great way to put it.
It's about acknowledging that real lasting change, it takes time, it takes strategy, a deep understanding of the system that you're trying to reform.
Absolutely.
It's fascinating how this whole conversation about the state from ancient Greece to modern Pakistan keeps circling back to this idea of informed and engaged citizenship. It's not just about the structures of power, but it's also about the people who live within those structures and their capacity to shape them.
That's a powerful point because ultimately
it's up to us.
The kind of political order we create, it depends on us. It depends on our understanding of these principles, our willingness to participate in thoughtful debate, and our commitment to working together to build a more just and equitable society.
It really highlights how crucial it is, for citizens to understand not just their rights, but also like the mechanisms of power, how to engage with them effectively.
Absolutely.
And that brings us back to this whole journey we've been on in this deep dive.
Yeah.
We started way back in ancient Greece, explored, the evolution of the state, delved into the complexities of Islam and governance, ended up with this deep analysis of the challenges and potential solutions facing Pakistan's political order today.
It's remarkable how those threads connect, isn't it?
It really is.
From ancient philosophy to modern constitutionalism. It all speaks to this fundamental human desire for order, for justice, for a system of governance that reflects the needs and aspirations of the people.
And it's not just like some abstract academic exercise, right? This has real-world implications.
Absolutely.
Yeah?
It shapes the societies we live in, the lives we lead.
Exactly.
And this is where I think the idea of ijtihad becomes so powerful. It's not just a concept confined to Islamic legal scholarship. It's a mindset.
It's a way of thinking.
A way of approaching challenges with reason, critical thinking. A willingness to adapt to new circumstances.
Those are qualities that are essential for any engaged citizen in any society.
I completely agree.
It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in shaping the future of our communities, our nations.
And that brings me to a final thought-provoking question for you, dear listener.
Ooh, I like it. Hit us with it.
If you were to design a deep dive course on responsible citizenship in a constitutional democracy,
okay, so
what would be the first lesson you'd include?
Like, what would be lesson 1?
What would you want every citizen to understand about their role in shaping a just and equitable society?
It's a fantastic question to ponder.
It really is.
And I think it perfectly encapsulates the spirit of this entire deep dive.
Absolutely.
It's about moving beyond passive observation, embracing our roles as active, informed, engaged citizens.
Well said.
This conversation doesn't end here.
It doesn't.
It's something we need to keep exploring, keep debating.
Absolutely.
And most importantly, acting upon in our own lives and communities.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
So keep those mental gears turning. And until next time,
happy deep diving.
Happy deep diving.